Good morning, everybody. Michael the Maven. Huge, exciting announcement from Canon about the development of the R5. We're freaking out about it, obviously. And something that I can offer with my background is that I like to look at pieces of information. So if we get something here and we get something here, a lot of times we can infer what's in between. So there's a lot of things that are unsaid about this camera, but I'm also pretty certain that I can come to certain conclusions about like the crop factor in 8K, 4K 120, crunch a little math, look at the data rates, and there's some information that we can come to some pretty solid conclusions. I will also give you my estimated price at the end of the video, but first I want to talk about the ergonomics. Canon released a 360 video where you can look around the camera. I am obviously very interested in the usability and ergonomics. When the Canon R first came out, I had a number of complaints about the buttons and the layout and things of that nature. And there's some good news and there's some bad news. The bad news is the power switch on the top left-hand side of the camera, it looks like it's still there. And I'm also not a huge fan of the mode dial on the R, and it looks like now on the R5, in that you have to make multiple button presses to switch modes. I really like analog mode dials where you can just flip it and you're ready to go. For example, switching from video to stills. If that takes 3 button presses, I'm not gonna be happy about that, but I'm trying to reserve judgment until I actually get the camera in my hands. Now, something that's interesting about the R5 is it does look to be a little bit wider than the R, just a touch. The eyepiece also looks to be just a little bit deeper, which is a good thing. But with the IBIS and some of these other features, we can probably come to the conclusion that it's going to weigh a little bit more than the R. There are a number of very awesome improvements, specifically the joystick. As a left-eyed dominant shooter whose nose was constantly being jammed into the monitor on the R and the RP, I found them almost unusable because I was trying to change my focusing squares right where my nose was on that back monitor. And now left-eyed and right-eyed shooters alike are going to have that ability to change focusing squares without worrying about this. If you notice on the left side of the camera, there's a blue microphone there. That icon we've seen in higher end Canon cameras, essentially an audio memo ability. It's not a big feature, but it looks like we'll be able to record audio files onto our images. I liked that the touchpad was gone. I thought it was a mistake. I know there are a lot of people who loved it. I wasn't able to get it to work the way I think Canon wanted it to. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, and I felt frustrated with it. If you look at the button placement, this was very well thought out with the tension control on the thumb. It's not interfering. There's space there for the thumb to rest without hitting buttons. And at the same time, we have a huge number of controls. You will also notice the secondary control wheel is now rotating. It's not that directional pad, but it does look to be like it could be touch sensitive. We saw this on the 5D Mark III when you were changing, your video controls while shooting. I'm hoping that is the case, but it looks like a gorgeous, beautiful, spectacular camera with everything, all the bells and whistles we could want. I'm really excited about it. Trust me, I can't wait to get my hands on it. But let's talk about the 8K video. Now that Canon has confirmed this, there's a number of analyses we can do to come to certain conclusions. And the number one question I'm getting about it is, will it have crop? And the answer is no. This will be a full frame 8K video sensor. And the reason we can say that is we know the standard of 8K video when we're looking at a 16:9 aspect ratio. If we do the math, that's 33 megapixels. 33 megapixels is the minimum requirement at 16:9 aspect ratio. But when we do the math for a 3:2 aspect ratio, now we're looking at a 39 megapixel sensor. Basically what I'm saying is if Canon rumors put a CR3 designation that this was going to be a 45 megapixel sensor, what I'm saying is 39 is the minimum. And there are some pretty easy calculations we can do using the Pythagorean theorem where we can calculate crop factors. If it has a pixel width of 7,680 pixels, there's not going to be any crop in terms of width. If we look at the next highest resolution for 8K video. We're looking at 8,192 pixels wide, and at a 16:9 aspect ratio, it's 4,608 pixels tall. If we calculate that for a 3:2 aspect ratio, multiply those numbers, the total megapixels we get is 44.7. If we do the crop analysis looking at the hypotenuse, that would have a minimum crop factor of about 1.07x. It's essentially what I'm saying, unless the sensor resolution is like something that we're not really expecting. The conclusion that I'm coming to is that the sensor is going to have a resolution between 39 and 44.7 megapixels. That makes sense. If I was a betting man, which I'm not, I would say this is a 44.7 megapixel sensor. Now, that's the good news. There's some bad news with this in that we also heard that there could be 4K 120 frames per second. And in that case, looking at the dimensions of 4K video and doing the same calculations over again, this would be closer to a 2x crop, something in that neighborhood, if we're looking at the 4K 120 frames per second. There is some data comparisons we can do when we looked at the numbers that Andrew Reed did over at EOS HD, where he said 5.5K 60 frames per second is the same data readout as 4K 120 frames per second, which is the same readout as 8K 30 frames per second. And we already have that 5.5K 60 in the 1DX. This leads me to the conclusion that in terms of processing power required for 990 million pixels per second, it's all the same in those three formats, means that the R is going to have dual processors, probably looking at the Digic 8 with a Digic 10, very similar to what they did in the 1DX, maybe a little bit more, but they need high-end processing power to generate that amount of data and get it onto a memory card that quickly. There is a problem with this, and this opens up the discussion between heat versus file size. And the background that you would need to know for this conversation is the difference between interframe compression and intraframe compression. Intraframe compression basically means is that the camera compresses individual frames. They're all individual pictures. And the benefit of this is reduced processing power with a much larger file size. The opposite strategy is to use something called interframe compression, which looks at the next and the previous frames, figures out what's changed, and compresses accordingly. It greatly reduces the file size, but also greatly increases the processing power required. And this is why cameras overheat in the first place. When we're talking about and we're dealing with a camera that can create an 8K video, that's a lot of information that's being processed. It kind of leads me to believe these file sizes are going to be huge. If we look at anything similar to the 1DX Mark III, all I is 1,000 megabits per second. When we do the math, that works out to 7.5 gigabytes per minute, or just under half terabyte per hour, 450 gigabytes per hour, which means that the 8K video is going to be very data heavy, probably going to be processor heavy if you go with interframe, which means there's going to be a possibility it can overheat. And looking at the images, I don't see any fans or vents or anything like that. I am very curious how Canon is going to resolve this huge file size versus lots of heat generated. And there are probably going to be some limits in terms of whatever this 8K video is, if not just by the file size alone. Canon has also included the new H.265 codec, HEVC, which is an interframe compression. Again, this is processor heavy. It's going to be more efficient than what we've seen in H.264. But again, until we try it out, we won't really know. If Canon is going all out on this, it just makes more sense that to minimum have at least one CF Express card. Taking all of this data together and having an idea of the price of what this is going to cost, all of this leads me to the conclusion is that the R6 is going to be a much more popular camera, and Canon is strategically announcing the R5 beforehand to generate the buzz. So what will happen is in the R6, it's not going to be 8K capable. It's just not going to be able to do it. It doesn't have the resolution in the sensor. However, If it is the 20 megapixels that's it's rumored to be, it's probably going to cost less and it's going to be easier to use in terms of video and basic shooting. And the conclusion that I'm coming to is the R6 is going to be the big home run unless you need 8K or high resolution. I know that's a lot of information. That is me putting together the best information possible from different sources and coming to certain conclusions. It's going to be 8K. It's not going to be a crop. It's going to be expensive, $39.99 minimum. We can say that because Canon's been charging a premium for the RF lenses. I think the R6 is probably going to be sub $3,000, probably 2,800 in that area. And I think it's going to be a very exciting year for Canon and everybody else. Sony is now going to need to step up to the plate. In any event, if you enjoy this kind of analysis, I would love to earn your subscription. If you're struggling to learn your camera, check out one of my many camera videos. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.